Welcome everybody, Scaling for Growing Live Audience. My name is Edward Doty. I'm the Creative Director at Ranker. Thank you for coming. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of things. Scaling for the demands of a growing live audience can mean so many things. It can mean how do you customize the content? How do you customize the tech, personnel, workload, workflow? And these four gentlemen are going to help answer that question. So we're going to start with just a quick introduction, starting at the very end with Dan. If we could work our way forward, just introduce yourself, who you're with, and sort of your experiences that brought you here today.
So I'm Carl Furgusson of MediaKind. We
Carl.
do video compression and streaming technologies, network PVR and TV middleware platforms. And for the past year or so, I've been involved in doing live 360-degree video streaming of sports, events, music events, concerts, and public interest.
Great. Okay. Tim?
I'm Tim Baldwin. I run product at Zixi. And what Zixi's doing is enabling broadcast quality delivery of live video over any and all IP networks.
Corey Smith. I run the broadcast technology group at Blizzard Entertainment. My team is responsible for media asset management, archiving, transmission from a backhaul repackaging standpoint, DRM, server-side ad insertion. We run a lot of cloud operations for both Overwatch League, BlizzCon, and soon CDL launching in January.
Cool.
And I'm Dan Pisarski, VP of Engineering for LiveU. LiveU makes portable uplink encoders used largely in the news industry for all of the live shots and increasingly in sports and esports to do live right from the location.
Cool. And as I said, my name is Edward Doty, currently Creative Director at Ranker. Prior to that, I was Head of Live Broadcasting at Legendary Digital Networks, and then also at Juki Media, so where we had several brands doing live content for multi-platform. The key word for this, I think, is scaling, right? Because having a big audience is great, but the challenge is in the scale. So I kind of want to start off with just a little bit of a thought exercise, and we'll go down and get answers from everybody. Sometimes, especially in the live digital world, you can be sort of an overnight sensation. You can gain a lot of viewers and a lot of audience relatively quickly. Let's say you wake up and all of a sudden you're working or contributing to a project that has scaled its audience 100x. What to you, and I'd love to hear from each one of you, what your primary concern would be. This could either be on the technical side, this could be on the personnel side, it could be on the content side, it could be on the platform side. If you scaled that fast overnight, what would be, to you, your primary concern?
I think if I'd scaled up that quickly, the first thing would be to increase the reliability. Can I guarantee that that stream is always going to be there? And if I start to grow rapidly and my viewers are probably more than just one geographic region, then how reliable is the delivery to the consumer?
Yeah, I'm thinking along the same lines. If you've scaled that much, then you have a much larger audience, and anything that goes wrong, would have a much larger impact. So I think reliability is the right kind of thing to think about. And that, what you might do for that are things like having multiple contribution streams from from on-premise up to your cloud-based processing. You might want to do some kind of hitless failover at your endpoints prior to packaging and delivery out via OTT like HLS or Dash. But I think looking at redundancy and reliability becomes even more critical as the audience gets larger and the event becomes much more visible.
So from Blizzard's point of view, I've been there for 2 years. My job on day one is to basically start building a kind of proprietary television distribution platform. Mm-hmm. So we had to look at a number of different things, both from the client side, what their expectations were, what was going to be the demand, how to scale that from a distribution standpoint, and then from an origin standpoint, how were we going to actually be able to scale that? Did we need to go dual ingest? The thing for us was always figuring out what our scale units were. So a lot of our software is built on microservice architecture. So we have to figure out what our scale units are, and we have to basically make sure that there's 0 points of failure in our network. So it's from the ground to the cloud. Backup redundancy. We have backup redundancy in multiple geo regions of our cloud provider. Then we have multiple layers of redundancy built into each one of those availability zones. And then from our distribution, our carrier out to the client itself has to be redundant as well. So we take into account the entire life cycle of the video asset as it's coming from the venue all the way to the distribution point where the customer is consuming it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Everybody kind of mentioned reliability, especially reliability in the contribution point where LiveU would care. A lot of times that redundancy on the contribution point, you want an entirely different technology in case literally all fiber goes down, right? The fiber cut's not there in the stadium, it's up the road at the highway where a train crash happened or something like that. So you want satellite or cellular or something that's a entirely different path out of the source zone, but not related directly to my job or LiveU's job. Happened, I think, even on the plane in. Obviously, people come to the conference talking about scalability of everything, not just the video delivery. But if you've got a credit card processing for people to pay to watch something, or the login authentication to prove that they did pay, make sure that can scale too. Because they were telling an anecdote that I happened over here secondhand of we had all the video ready to scale and millions of people ready to watch, and we realized then that the authentication step couldn't scale right, and nobody could log in because it was too much of a demand.
I mean, that's happened a number of times in the last 2 years on real events. Yep.
Because we've just said, everything we've said here is duplicate, backup, redundancy, so you've got to make sure there's enough money coming in.
Yeah.
All of that cost.
Well, that's the same problem. If you look at from the offerings that are out in the industry, another little video service launched last week and had problems. So I mean, even the biggest companies that want to go tackle this problem are still having the same problems as a smaller OTT provider.
Yeah, I want to follow up just kind of with that train of thought, because it sounds like reliable stream quality to the end user is obviously paramount importance. And we're talking about scalability, have any of you or all of you, and in what fashion, had an experience where you've taken something and that started off relatively small and actually grown to exponential sizes? And if so, what were some of the challenges that you faced as you scaled? Aside from just sort of the product fidelity and quality, but what were some of the other challenges you experienced as you saw something grow from something relatively small to something like Blizzard Overwatch League or Call of Duty League?
Do you have any good examples?
Well, I've got quite a few actually, but so Overwatch League is interesting because we do a lot of scale with our distribution partners. So our media rights deals with Twitch in the last couple of years have really allowed us to scale quite dramatically. Our deal with ESPN and ABC networks has allowed us to scale as well. So from that distribution, the workflow didn't really require us to have to build big CDN infrastructure to deliver those bits from a global perspective. Flip the script on that from a BlizzCon perspective, that's essentially live television concurrently across 7 different stages simultaneously. So it's like 7 different Super Bowls happening simultaneously. So from our standpoint, that is an owned and operated delivery because we treat BlizzCon.com as a product. We have this virtual ticket offering that is basically the paywall to get past in order to watch some of the premium content. So people are paying $50 a ticket for the weekend to watch this content, and we have to be able to scale rapidly anywhere in the world the distribution of that. So we use a lot of cascading kind of waterfall kind of methodology on how to scale and fan out from the origin, making sure that we're not creating hotspots on any given both ISP and our CDN delivery partners. So we take a lot of time into stressing to fail. So we feel like that if we can get a component to knock itself over based on the load we're giving it, then that's a positive test, right? So you talk about kind of single sign-on, the authentication system. We use what is called BattleNet in our world, which is our single sign-on system for Blizzard. That's the same OAuth mechanism that you would come into BlizzCon.com. So 2 different workflows, 2 different types of streaming, both have to be high availability in terms of its delivery and reliability, but it's a different technology at the edge to distribute that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You mentioned the ONO platform. For anybody here, are there any differences to delivering to an ONO platform versus to maybe a Twitch or a Facebook Live or a YouTube Live? What are some of the inherent differences for scaling on an ONO versus third party or some of these bigger streaming platforms?
I think one of the things is when you truly own and operate, then you know that you've almost guaranteed that infrastructure being available.
Yes.
We've had a number of experiences, particularly with event-based delivery, where the network was good the last time you did an event, a week or two ago.
Sure.
An hour or two beforehand, when you actually come and try and start up some of that cloud-based processing, and then suddenly find on a Sunday morning that there were no GPU resources in the compute node that you're about to use in the public cloud. Those are the sorts of things where you'd start to learn about reserving compute ahead of time, being able to get some DevOps on it pretty quickly to change some of your scripting to call up the next GPU or the next CPU that you were trying to call up. And you better know the phone number of the person to call when you need that network working. So those are the sorts of things that you learn on an event-by-event basis when you're using somebody else's infrastructure over owning that yourself.
Right.
Sure. I think some of the, you called out a couple different points, right? Speaking of like cloud in general, like you don't know the last time the service component, unless you're exercising it every single day or every single week, you don't know that the code underlying that component has changed out from underneath you because of some security patch or other things. So what was working one week is all of a sudden not working the next. And to your point, being able to throw DevOps on that and actually figure out like, hey, how do I back rev this component, or what's the fix? What was introduced? There's like change management is something that needs to be tackled in an old cloud-based workflow, I believe, because there's always things like Lambda that gets updated and you don't know anything about what changed, but you just know that your script is no longer executing. So really, the monitoring and alerting piece is really pinnacle to managing a cloud-based distribution system.
When you touched on a little bit, exercising it, I mean, it is hard to scale, right? Because you can test it at a small scale to try to catch things like some weird underlying security patch change the behavior here, but there is a class of bug that will only happen at the huge scale.
Sure.
You're right, and you think to yourself, boy, we ran our load simulation on it and everything seemed fine, and then the actual real scale hits and something goes wrong, and it turns out that it's not related to it's only tangentially related to the huge scale. It's still that weird software patch at the bottom. It just only exhibits when a thread locks for a certain amount of time, or a race condition, the weird kind of condition.
There's nothing like production load on it.
Yeah.
For sure.
We talk about scaling and the relationship with different platforms. I think it's interesting. I think part of scale is more and more platforms, right? I think it's not just an O&O. It's not just a YouTube. You have to have a Facebook strategy, even and Snap is not really a live platform, but how does live broadcast, VOD, eventually get windowed down to Snap and other platforms? To me, I think it's, and this is something we encountered a lot at Legendary, was sort of giving the user a custom experience for the platform. What we found is that audiences, even if they're loyal to the brand, if they're loyal to the Blizzard brand or whatever, they're also loyal to the platform brand to a certain extent. So what considerations do each of you take as you're going to have this content existing on multiple platforms? What customizations do you take? Do you factor in things like, okay, we know that most Facebook mid-roll, Facebook Live people are watching on mobile. What do you have to do to sort of make that content feel bespoke to the platform while also being true across multiple platforms?
From a Blizzard standpoint, when we've done things like BlizzCon, or we do things like Overwatch League, we do happen at certain times stream to a Facebook and YouTube, especially like a BlizzCon where opening ceremony, we wanted it on as many platforms as absolutely possible. But once that stream leaves your possession, you no longer have chain of custody on what the bits are on the other side, and it's going through some other ingest point that you're unfamiliar with and that you really don't have any control over. It turns into kind of this black box situation. So you really hope that the engineers on the other side of the wall really kind of understand what both the load characteristics are going to be for that particular event, to be able to react in near real time to a spike event, and that can happen both in esports, in Blizzard broadcast world. It can happen in breaking news situations. So the scale problem exists in all industries, regardless of what the actual content is, and whether it doesn't really matter what platform you're actually on. If that team is unable to react appropriately, then your stream on that platform will die. And so you hope that things like YouTube and Facebook have enough scale built in, Twitch, et cetera, you don't wind up having those problems. But I don't know if anybody's streamed to those platforms, but there's not a lot of like monitoring, alerting you get back from some of those systems.
Yeah,
so
I think,
it's kind of one of those things where you're really like you're hoping for the best, and you know that you're running that RTMP stream and you're not seeing any drop packets for the encoder. So awesome. Let's just watch it and figure it out. But
So I think that depends very much on what you're trying to do from the delivery platform perspective. I mean, if you're trying to start up or you're trying to get fast, cheap / no cost delivery infrastructure, then hey, you go put on YouTube, you go put on Facebook, at which point you don't have the storage cost, you don't have the CDN cost, you maybe get some advertising money back.
Sure.
But you have no control after that point in time. We tend to do events that are more operator-led, so they've got control of the app, they've gone out to 1 or 2 CDN vendors and paid and brought their capacity on the CDNs. So there's much more of a complete end-to-end control there. But obviously then they're taking all of that cost, right? They're taking all the cost of app development, app supplier, CDN costs. If you're scaling up enough, then you're suddenly into multi-CDN strategy, like maybe you heard in one of the sessions before the break. They're very different mixes, but there's pros and cons to both sides of that. And if you're starting up and you want high scale at low cost, then certainly going out to platforms like YouTube and Twitch is some of the places to start. But maybe within that, you then like content search and content find. You've really got to drive your brand identity another way, because people have to find your content amongst all the other stuff on those platforms.
Absolutely. Yeah. So some of going back to BlizzCon from an example, and I don't mean to dominate the table here, but the show itself is like in itself this massive scale from a production standpoint, but from a distribution standpoint, we send streams. Basically, we have to manage 269 different stream endpoints that we're actually pushing traffic to during the course of that event. Some of them are Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, etc. Some of them are owned and operated. So when so like an opening ceremony where there's this huge inrush of customers wanting to see our content, because that's when all of the product announcements are going to come. That's where all the big buzz is going to be created for the entire show. We'll push multiple terabits per second across the CDN provider within minutes. And it's that type of ramp and scale that we have to not only build into our CDN provider, but it also has to be built in from fail-safe standpoint at the origin. So we can at least control that experience end to end, because that's where we want the ultimate experience to be. But we also then have to maintain some kind of level of monitoring on the Twitch and the Facebooks of the world as well. So when my team stands up BlizzCon for the first time for opening ceremony, like we've got a multi-viewer, that is undoubtedly like almost completely unmanageable to some degree. So we have to rely on things like InioQuest that will actually tell us when streams have stopped running and working, because we're testing both at the origin and the edge to find out if there's any failures in the middle. So the monitoring strategy, the reporting and the alerting is just as important as the content itself.
Very cool. So we talked about events. What are some of the, especially for something like a touring show, like not dissimilar from what Call of Duty League is doing this year, and certainly other things that sort of face globally. How do you reliably transport your entire setup so that you know that you're going to get the same fidelity in and out? What are some of the things you look for? What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the things that people should be aware of?
Well, I think one of the strategies there that we see some of our customers taking advantage of is the idea of bringing your own bandwidth, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a well planned out travel schedule in very reliable arenas or stadiums, and you're going to be able to get fiber at a reasonable cost or a cost that fits your budget out of that. But sometimes you either know ahead of time you're not getting that, or you're walking into a situation for whatever reasons where your timeline's shrunk a little bit and you don't have as much time to vet all of that. So bringing in your own bandwidth, cellular, of course, satellite, whatever the strategies might be, is one strategy to say, okay, even if it's my backup stream or my primary stream, at least this one I know I've brought in my own bandwidth, and then I can haggle with Freeman or whoever it is, on what it's going to cost to get the fiber out.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's key is planning on having multiple IP networks going off premise up to the cloud, and then also using some kind of protection protocol with ARQ and FEC, so that even if you have two networks, they may both have some packet loss and jitter on the way up. And then you might also consider a bonding type solution. So you may have multiple IP networks and they're all sending bits up, and the number of bits getting through successfully is going to vary from network to network. So being able to bond that up in the cloud so that you always have you have all of your bits there to then move into your processing. So if you do that, if you have the multiple IP connections with the protection and with some bonding, then you can go to pretty much any venue and be pretty sure that you're going to reliably get your streams up into your cloud processing.
Right.
I mean, what we find is test that network as soon as and early as you can. I mean, we built line testers into we have a sender app that basically pushes out, sends all the content from venue up into the cloud. We made that, we built a line tester into that. And all the production companies and everybody else that we work with, they have that app, right? So as soon as they're on site, even a few weeks beforehand, doing maybe checking out camera locations or other things like that, they can just start to run a line test. Even at that point in time, we log all the results. But because if there's not the speed that you want from a connection standpoint, hey, you've at least got a couple of weeks to try and sort it out rather than a couple of hours or a day. And then as soon as we get back on site to actually do the event, the first thing is you run that line tester again. And you just keep checking and checking and checking, because the more time you've got to resolve, certainly data speed capacity out of the venue into anywhere else, then the easier the day is going to be.
Yeah, it's money having those kind of testers. Specifically, so the last couple of years, Overwatch League has operated out of what we called BALA, Blizzard Arena Los Angeles. That was a purpose-built esports venue that always had connectivity and that was always relatively stable, and it was used and exercised every week. So fast forward to 2020, when we launched the leagues, both Overwatch League and Call of Duty League in January, February, we'll be on basically kind of like a rock tour. There's 20 teams in Overwatch League in 20 different cities across the world. So we have to be able to figure out how to get back-to-back shows up and running between New York, London, and mainland China all in the same week and a half. So we have gear that we have to push out into the world. We have partners, and one of the key takeaways too from a scaling standpoint is you have to have the right partners in your ecosystem. You have to be able to count on these guys to be there, and Johnny on the spot when things hit the fan. So one of the things that we encounter too is we've ditched satellite and fiber. It's not part of our workflow. We're an IP digital world first. The only hardware that actually you have to buy is the on-ground contribution encoders. Everything else, once it leaves the venue, is all IP. Everything is then repackaged and cut and stored in the cloud and distributed from there. So I have to build ingestion points in all different types of geographic locations across our different cloud infrastructure to be able to ingest the single pass from all 20 of these venues across the world. So whether a show's coming out of South Korea one weekend, we may be in Los Angeles the next day. Yep. So we have to be able to scale both the on-ground production and our ability to capture and distribute those streams.
So you touched on localization. I want to get into that in just a little bit more in a second, but I have a quick anecdote regarding that. At Legendary, we used to produce a live stream Dungeons & Dragons show called Critical Role. And with 4 weeks notice, we decided we were going to take it out of the confines of our studio in Burbank and do it at an opera house in Indianapolis in cadence with this event called Gen Con. So from the event side, it was all fine, but we had to very quickly learn how to stream this show that our users had grown accustomed to with a certain degree of quality, and basically an opera theater that was run by local union folks who were not familiar with the live streaming setup. So I think sort of the first thing we did was determine what the upload speed at the venue was. 75, not great, not bad. Really, we only need about 35, but we always like to have that redundancy in there. But that was not redundant enough. So there's a vendor in Riverside, or on Riverside in Valley Village, who would rent sort of mobile hotspots, and then we got, I think, 3 different service provider cards. Literally had to climb to the roof of the Opera House. We plugged multiple in there because we're streaming to 2 platforms, Twitch and our own OSVOD. And I think with about 4 weeks notice, we figured out how to do that. We brought a TriCaster Mini, but we also didn't have that sophisticated workflow for our Twitch stream. So we literally had to take as carry-on luggage a streaming PC wrapped in cellophane. So that served as a footrest at times. So it can be done if you don't have the funding of, let's say, a Blizzard or an NBC Universal or something like that. It does require, like you said, Johnny on the spot and a fair bit of scrappiness. And it turned out fine. Didn't even have to use the encoder once, but it was a nice little breath of relief for only $300 for the weekend. Moving on, localization. Global audience. How do you real-time localize for audiences in a way that doesn't impact your physical production workflow too significantly? And what is the tipping point? What is the tipping point where you say, okay, we can't localize any further at the expense of the core broadcast, knowing that your audience is mostly going to be North America and Western Europe? At what point do you say we can't go any further without significantly impacting the broadcast?
That's a good one.
I got answers. So there's kind of 2 different approaches we take for localization. I'll touch on the Overwatch one, and then I'll cut back to BlizzCon. So Overwatch, typically it's been done in North America, here in Burbank. So it's English first show. Next year it'll be in a local, if it's in South Korea, the show will originate in Korea, or Korean, sorry. And then we'll localize it to English here in the United States. So that's kind of a different touch on the localization piece. But last year, and how we kind of scale our global distribution is we essentially take our clean feeds, send them to local providers in key areas that are partners. They'll actually put their own spin on the show, put their dirty flavor of it, and then restream it back to us so we can offline record it, check QC, and then QA it back out to our distribution channels. So we'll send a live stream all the way to Korea. They'll send it back to us, and then we'll basically line record it and then redistribute it back to Twitch on their behalf. That's just one workflow. So last year we had 6 different regional partners that we used: Russian, Portuguese, French, German, Russian, and Chinese. So 6 plus English is 7. For BlizzCon, last year we actually did 8 languages live, English being the 8th language, and then we had 7 regional languages. But that was all done UN-style voice translation at the actual Anaheim Convention Center. So we actually took our video feed with English up to the 3rd floor of the Convention Center. 32 translators were sitting in ISO booths speaking their native language back into the broadcast. We sent that back down, remuxed it back into the feed with them clever embedding, and before it even hit the ground encoders to go to cloud. Last year we actually did the same thing, but the translators were actually off-site in Valencia, California. So we actually sent a feed via Skype, of all things, to that to that regional localized partner, and they sent us back all the audio streams, and we kind of did the re-embed just like we had done in previous years. So that's one way of us scaling multi-language.
That raises a good question, and I want to hear from everybody. You mentioned using Skype. What is the one product service feature commercially available that is indispensable in your workflow, not custom made? Is it Slack? Is it, what would people be surprised to learn is your absolute go-to for either a live event, live stream, live production? What's the one thing that people I think would be surprised to hear about? Because there's always that one, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, you'd already mentioned it. So Slack is one for us. We're in the middle of an event where you've got techs on site trying to keep stuff working. You've got people at the remote site maybe doing some monitoring. You've got some DevOps at another location as well. Then actually just that Slack channel just to keep everybody coordinated, because it's not voice anymore, right?
Right.
And as soon as anything remotely starts going wrong or someone starts to spot that there's a bit more latency, a bit more delay, some packet loss, whatever it might be, you know, as soon as it gets picked up somewhere, then everybody can start tapping away. And actually that is one of the biggest ones for us on a live event.
Slack is another tool we use for communication. We just use Cisco Web Teams as well. Different parts of the business use different communication tools. We use Zixi quite a bit for both ground to cloud and within cloud to other distribution partners. We find it a very effective lightweight transport protocol for us to use to ship bits halfway around the world and back. It's actually one of our partners that we use in a lot of our broadcast work. They allow us to do the low latency back and forth between our regional partners. So most of our kind of contribution feed is really done with a lot of Zixi transport. So.
For us, I mean, it's usually our customers doing the production. We just certainly see a lot of Slack use. That is a growing tool in the video production space. But for us personally, if we're there assisting, one of the little non-LiveU pieces of gear that's become indispensable for us is actually the Ubiquity Wi-Fi radios.
Okay.
You know, weirdly configurable. You can touch every single part of the Wi-Fi protocol. You can do in-air scans to see where the interference is coming from. If you're trying to do any kind of in-venue wireless or on-site wireless, they're really fantastic. I'm not getting any kickback from Ubiquity, but
Yeah, no sponsor list here. I'm gonna have an unconventional answer to that one. I'm gonna say OBS. OBS is free and it's great. And the reason why so at Mammoth Media, where I was, venture-backed mobile startup, we had 3 Ono apps. One of them was a HQ competitor called Arena, live trivia, team-based, modular cash prize. First game show on the app with in-app purchases. Our workflow, our back-end engineers assumed we wouldn't be spending that much on production. So they basically made the RTMP ingest only recognize Wirecast or OBS. And I went and bought a NewTek TC1. But also more than that, my technical directors and I wanted to make sure that we were taking the load for streaming off of, because we're doing a lot of keying. We did a funky trick where we actually set the camera sideways, because on a 1080p pixel ratio, you get more, we basically put the camera that way, so you're getting more pixels on the vertical since we're live to mobile on non-screen. Good. And so we would ingest the image sideways, key, audio mix, music soundtrack, do all that stuff. But for actual broadcast, we wanted just one clean line, one just dedicated system committed to streaming. So we had the least load off of that as possible. So OBS and then the Aja UTAP. That was like our everything was just like centered around this one little box. And if something happened to that, if somebody spilled their Coke, then the entire show would go down. That's why I asked that question.
Interesting.
Tim, I actually want you to talk about Zixi for a little bit, if you can, and sort of what Zixi's presence in the state of live streaming is and what you guys can kind of offer.
Sure, yeah. So what Zixi's providing is both a cloud-based and on-premise, I guess we can call it like video, a software-defined video platform. And what we're enabling is being able to deliver live or linear broadcast streams across IP. So this could be the public internet, it could be fiber. Maybe you don't want to spend extra money on your MPLS, or a lower quality, lower SLA fiber. You run Zixi over that. It could be, we have now just last week, SpaceX put up 400 low orbit satellites. So we're, before long we're going to have low orbit IP networks, swarming around the globe, which will have packet loss and jitter and other problems. So where Zixi comes into play is allowing you to either contribute up to your cloud processing or backhaul from point A to point B, different places on the planet through these IP networks instead of the older broadcast workflows where you're always going through video style satellite, not IP satellite. And then the other piece of this is for our larger customers being able to orchestrate and manage hundreds or thousands of linear channels. So in the early days of Zixi, our software, you could set it up. The UI was kind of geared for maybe managing 2 or 3 or 10 channels of content. But now what we have is our customers that have maybe 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 channels, all linear channels, originating with one customer. So so the piece there is really giving them access and visibility to all of their channels, and you mentioned earlier having lots of channels and like too many channels to even monitor.
Yeah.
Right. And so with all these channels, we're monitoring for things like frozen frames or the audio disappears or the audio's clipping, or you have a black screen or a green screen. So really trying to enable the customers to, one, deliver lots of live linear across IP, but two, manage really large bouquets of channels without having to have huge teams with eyes on glass watching everything.
Gotcha. So I kind of want to use that to pivot into the direct opposite of that and actually talk about eyes on glass. I want to talk about sort of after the live stream or during the live stream. Love to hear what each one of you look for when you're in a post-mortem environment or in whoever in your team's responsible for looking at it sort of from a 30,000 foot view, and what kind of questions they have to ask themselves. There's obvious things like bit rate drop and audio clipping and all the sort of obvious things. But what are the things that you look for assessing quality in a live stream?
Various different. I mean, obviously, there's the video part of it, so visual quality. Generally, you expect that you've done a decent job of encoding and that hopefully the bits will make it to the other end and give a good picture at the other end. So we spend probably more time, which is odd for a video compression company, just really looking at traffic stats. So we actually, from the event onwards, we actually push up in ABR, in segmented format, rather than pushing linear transport stream. From the point that we've done capture and production, everything onwards, we're doing in packetized format. So actually, as we're pushing segmented packets up, it's this trade-off of latency versus using the ABR side for reliability. We push in segmented format from the event venue upwards, all the way through our cloud production and then all the way through to the delivery. So there we're looking at return time losses, packet losses, delay, and because everything from the capture onwards is clocked on those segment boundaries, then we're really watching the entire workflow on what is either a 5-second segment boundary or a 2-second segment boundary, depending on what we're trying to do for end-to-end latency. So with a 360 video, we're on about 32-second glass-to-glass with a 5-second segment. We're on about 16 seconds end-to-end latency on a 2-second segment boundary, from the point of capture on the camera to the point of consumer delivery. So we're just watching all of those traffic stats all the way through, because if we see the bad stats, that probably means we're getting packet loss somewhere, and then everything else goes bad from the experience perspective.
Right.
From how we interpret the data, we look at origin offload, we look at rebuffer rate, we look at qualified bit rate. Maybe in some areas of the world, maybe nobody can. So we encode everything at 10 megabit, 1080p 60. So from that standpoint, does our audience even qualify for that?
Right.
How often are they actually hitting that, or is there pockets of the world that are actually lower, much lower than that? So it helps us kind of tune our distribution that way. But we look at a lot of the client telemetry.
I want to get to questions really quickly, but I want to pivot off that for a second, because there is that sort of constant conversation between creative and our end. I'd love to hear about any sort of instances people have had where you've had to say to either the EP or the showrunner or whoever, hey, you know what? Because of this current state of the stream, because of the way it is, maybe not spend so much time on wide shots. Maybe not spend so much time on these really big shiny floor jibs where it's just going to look like a block of pixels. Maybe consider your framing. I'd love to hear about dynamics, or just really quickly any sort of instances where you've said like, hey, this isn't going to work based on the realities of the live streaming environment.
I was just having a conversation, smaller streamer doing a talk show on Twitch, and somebody not familiar themselves with the way discrete cosine transform codecs work, and they had the set that they had built was all Mylar fringe, like you would have it at like a birthday party or something, all around the set, and they're just complaining like, why does this look so horrible? I'm explaining to the macro blocks, and just change your set. Like you go back to the art direction and change your
Yep.
set, you're going to be so much happier than sitting here and tuning all of these technical encoding parameters to try to fix that. You know,
Yep.
just come up with a different art direction on the set. So it's going to be fine.
With gaming, you guys can't really control it, but that's some of the most complex
No, yeah. So
content to encode.
Yeah, Overwatch has how many particle effects every
Right.
explosion? Yeah.
it's definitely a hard stream to encode. We've done a pretty good job, but we've actually had quite a bit of under the hood tweaking of some of the way that the encoder actually functions.
Yep.
The code profiles are very, very tuned for specific Overwatch content. What's going to be interesting is as games get more advanced with ray tracing and other things, is how does those dynamic things really affect the way we have to encode video. Hopefully it doesn't change at all, but like when a game is output at 144 and you're dumbing it down to 60, like what is the actual negligent effect of like reducing all of the content that you just like threw away, because broadcast quality is standardized at 60p, right? So when we do handoff to other television partners, they actually ask us to send them 720p, and we're like, that's not going to look good, and they're like, well, we don't care, and like, okay, we'll send it to you, and then they complain, and then there's this back and forth, and then so the other interesting thing is when you start getting into like European distribution, now all of a sudden everybody wants to see 50, and you're like, what?
I think we could do a whole panel on the broadcast versus streaming OTT, small screen. That could be a whole separate discussion. Maybe it already is. I don't know. Cool. I want to open up to questions from anybody for these fine gentlemen. Sir.
So when you stream games, if you have 1080p 60 level A signal, did you say you stream 10 megabit per second?
10 megabit is our top bit rate. Yeah.
What is your encoder? Do you do software streaming on that?
It's magic. We have our ground encoders are either an Atem Triton or an Elemental 119. We have in some of our inventory, we do have the L300 and the L600 series. The Atem Triton has been pretty good ground encoder for us just because of its density. We've actually played around with also like media gateways like Sencor's DMG 4200, which actually now has a Zixi acceleration card in it as well. So we're playing with that on how we do like REMI backhaul for the future. So maybe in a future world of 2021, where actually all of our broadcast stuff is all backhauled and cut at some facility outside of the region that it's being produced in. So from an encode quality standpoint, at least the contribution is doing well with a CPU or a GPU bound encoder. And then our cloud infrastructure is typically done through like a media services workflow.
Do you use AWS
Yes,
sometimes?
all the time.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we're a few minutes early. Any other thoughts? Any other closing remarks? Any other things you guys want to share? Anything that excites you about the future? Anything that you see on the horizon that really kind of gets your blood pumping about either on the platform side, on the tech side, product side?
Low orbit IP satellites. I think that's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, just imagine being able to, stream anywhere on the planet through this big constellation of satellites.
Yeah.
It's gonna be awesome. It's so cool. It's gonna open up so many new workflows that you just aren't thinking about right now.
Very cool. Very cool.
You touched very briefly on REMI, which we didn't really talk about, but I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of scaling your production, being able to scale literally the number of productions you're doing and where you do them, I think REMI, everybody sort of agrees REMI is going to revolutionize that. And I think the possibility that you'll see, not just scale in the audience, but a scale of how many productions everybody can do and what
Yeah.
content's available out there.
Yeah, I'm for my part, I'm really excited to see real-time customization across platforms. I'm curious to see what Quibi does, and granted that's a VOD play, but I'm curious to see what the live implications of that I think could be. Because if you don't know, Quibi is doing this thing where you have one experience vertical, you rotate, you get additional screen, additional information, additional stuff happening in real time. Yeah, so I hope that's not NDA'd.
Too late now.
I know, right? No one's recording.
One of the things.
Really quickly, sir.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
One thing I'd like to touch upon is the latency. As you, especially for live audience, as you
I'll just answer real quick. We're not really concerning ourselves with ultra low latency type technology at the moment. We think that it's still in its early form. The only thing we're fighting is social media at that point if somebody's sitting in the venue. So otherwise, nobody knows that you're a minute and a half from live if like that's your latency on your IP stream that you're getting from your local connection. To us, we're in probably the 30 to 45 second glass to glass in most cases. We do have some of the FEC overhead when we do the transport piece, but for the most part, unless we're trying to fight social media, we don't have like a fantasy stat system like the NFL and the NBA does. So we don't have to deal with a lot of the influx of a betting community behind our sports.
And to that point, I would say, unless you're doing something hyper interactive, latency is not really the biggest concern. If you are doing something very interactive, megaphone, I mean, you can rely on a third-party vendor of some kind to time that and maintain cadence with your stream. So,
let me ask a quick question. When you're doing the localization, what kind of turnaround time from when you send it from here to Russia and back? What kind of turnaround times are you guys
on the regional streams?
Yeah, on the regional streams.
We're probably within, I would say, 45 seconds.
That's great.
That's Twitch. I mean, that's basically what Twitch is doing right now. So,
The other thing about localization from a UN translation standpoint, like that's within seconds. So the time that the person hears English, we're getting Russian back is within a couple seconds. The one thing I would call out for the future is the arms race to cloud production. So it's interesting to talk about REMI in one degree. So I've been involved with projects at other previous lives where maybe it's maybe the local television station's sacrificial lamb that we're all going to basically huddle in a single location somewhere that's heavily well connected in terms of internet and pipes out to these other distribution points to backhaul all of my camera feeds. So I have basically a master control setup in Denver, Colorado, but I'm operating every television station that my company owns on the West Coast or the East Coast, et cetera. But I have all my operators in a single piece. The next evolutional step to that is to take REMI, put it on its head and say, hey, I don't even need that studio anymore. I can basically cut my show in real time because I've solved the PTP timing problem, and all of a sudden I can do frame accurate cuts on cloud infrastructure, and I can set up any conference room anywhere in the world as my master control facility.
All right, I think that's time. I want to thank our panelists for today, and thank you all for coming.
Yay.